The first time Reuben Doyle dropped to one knee in the red dirt of Caldwell, Kansas, he did not even know the woman's name, and he would tell anyone who asked him afterward that it was the smartest thing he had ever done in his 31 years of living. It was the spring of 1882, and the cattle trails were still alive with dust and noise, and the restless movement of men who could not stay in one place long enough to grow roots. Caldwell sat right on the border of Kansas and Indian Territory, a rough town full of drovers and merchants and gamblers and women who had learned to read men, the way a river reads stones slowly, but with permanent consequence. The Santa Fe Railroad had come through 2 years prior, and that had changed everything about the town's character. There was money here now, or at least the smell of it, and where money moved, trouble followed close behind like a faithful dog. Reuben had ridden into Caldwell 3 days before with a cattle drive out of Texas, a herd of 900 longhorns that belonged to a rancher named Holly's Crane who had more ambition than sense. Reuben was the trail boss, which meant he was the man who kept everything from falling apart, and he had been doing that particular job since he was 24 years old. He was tall in the way that men who worked outdoors became tall, not from good posture, but from the habit of scanning horizons. His hair was dark, and his jaw was the kind that looked as though it had been shaped by someone who believed in straight lines. He had a reputation in the cattle country of Texas and Kansas for being fair, for being hard when hard was necessary, and for never once backing down from a thing he believed in. The herd had been sold, the paperwork signed at the railroad office, and now Reuben had 3 days before he needed to turn south again toward Texas and the next drive. He had money in his pocket and nothing particular pressing on his conscience, and so he had done what most men did in Caldwell after a long drive. He had cleaned up at the boarding house, eaten a meal that contained actual vegetables, and walked down to the main street with the intention of simply breathing for a while. That was when he saw her. She was standing outside the general merchandise store on the north side of 2nd Street, and she was having an argument with a man who was twice her width and clearly believed that his size entitled him to win every disagreement by default. The woman was not backing down. She was holding a crate of dry goods against her hip with one arm and pointing a finger at the man with the other, and her voice was carrying clearly across the dusty street. "I paid for this order in full 3 weeks ago," she said. "I have the receipt in my coat pocket, and if you would like to step back inside and look at your own ledger, you will find that I am telling you exactly the truth." The man, Reuben would later learn his name, was Burl Atchison, a freight contractor with a drinking problem and a habit of preying on people he believed could not fight back, crossed his arms over his broad chest, and smiled in the way that certain men smile when they are enjoying the discomfort of others. "The ledger says different," Burl said, "and a woman traveling alone ain't got the standing to argue with a man's ledger." The woman set the crate down on the boardwalk with deliberate care, as though she were giving herself a moment to decide what to do with her hands now that they were free. She straightened up and looked at Burl Atchison with an expression that Reuben could read from across the street. It was the expression of someone who was tired of a very specific kind of foolishness. Reuben crossed the street. He had not planned to get involved. He had learned over the years that getting involved in other people's disputes was a reliable way to end up with bruises, and he had enough bruises from the trail. But there was something about the way the woman was standing, not helpless, not frightened, simply outnumbered by a situation that was not fair, that pulled him across that street as surely as if someone had attached a rope to his belt. "Is there a problem here?" Reuben asked, stepping up onto the boardwalk. Burl looked at him with the assessment that men like Burl always performed, sizing up whether this newcomer was worth taking seriously. Reuben was wearing his trail clothes, which were clean but worn, and he had his hat tilted back in a way that some men read as casual and smarter men read as watchful. Burl apparently was not a smarter man. "Nothing that concerns you, Cowboy," Burl said. "I believe the lady has a receipt," Reuben said pleasantly. The woman turned to look at him, and that was the first moment Reuben Doyle truly saw her face. She had dark eyes, the kind that held color the way deep water holds light. You could see something in them, but you could not quite name what it was. Her hair was brown and pulled back under a sun-faded bonnet that had probably been nicer 3 years ago. She was perhaps 26 or 27, with a quality to her features that suggested she had been beautiful for so long that she had stopped thinking about it and moved on to more interesting concerns. There was a small scar at the corner of her left eyebrow that Reuben found himself wanting to ask about. She reached into her coat pocket and produced a folded piece of paper, which she held out to Reuben without saying a word. Her expression suggested she was curious to see what he would do with it. Reuben took it, unfolded it, read it over with the unhurried attention of a man who understood documents, and then held it out to Burl Atchison. "This receipt is dated March the 9th, Reuben said. "It's itemized and signed by the store owner, a Mr. H. Graves. I'd say that's pretty clear documentation of a paid order." He smiled. "Now, you're welcome to dispute it with Mr. Graves when he returns. But I think releasing the lady's goods while you work that out would be the gentlemanly approach." Burl stared at him for a long moment. The street was not empty. There were other people watching now, from doorways and across the way, and that changed the calculation for a man like Burl, who relied on not having witnesses. Burl muttered something that was technically an apology if you squinted at it sideways, turned, and walked back into the store. He returned a moment later with 2 additional boxes that he set down beside the woman's crate without a word before disappearing inside again. Reuben turned to the woman. She was looking at him with an expression he could not entirely read: appreciation, certainly, but also something careful, as though she was not yet sure what category to put him in. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was lower than he had expected, with a precision to her words that suggested she had been educated somewhere and had not let it slip away. "He had no cause to make trouble for you," Reuben said. He picked up the larger of the 2 boxes Burl had produced. "Can I carry these somewhere for you?" She hesitated for exactly 1 beat. "I have a wagon around the side," she said. They walked around to the wagon, which was a sensible working vehicle pulled by a patient bay horse. As Reuben loaded the boxes, he was aware of her watching him with that same careful attention, as though she was reading a document she had not quite decided whether to trust. "Are you passing through?" she asked. "Heading back to Texas in a few days," he said. "Trail boss for a drive that just finished. Long way from home. Texas is not exactly home," he said. "More of a place I return to regularly." She almost smiled at that. Almost. "Well," she said, setting the crate into the wagon bed, "I appreciate your help." She climbed up onto the seat and gathered the reins with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it for years. "I didn't catch your name," Reuben said. Something crossed her face then, a quick thing there and gone like a cloud shadow moving over open land. "Claire," she said. "Claire Weston." Reuben nodded. "Reuben Doyle," he said. "Safe travels, Miss Weston." She clicked to the horse, and the wagon moved forward, and Reuben stood on the side street watching it go and thinking about dark eyes and the particular shade of careful that some people wore when they had good reasons to be cautious. He did not see her again until the following afternoon. He had spent the morning at the stockyard office going over paperwork with the railroad agent, and the afternoon had deposited him at the far end of 2nd Street, where a woman named Mrs. Albright ran a respectable pie shop that Reuben had visited on every drive through Caldwell for the past 4 years. He was working through an excellent slice of dried apple pie and drinking coffee that was almost good enough to justify the price when the door opened and Claire Weston walked in. She saw him immediately and stopped for just a moment before continuing to a table on the opposite side of the room. She ordered coffee and sat with a leather-bound journal open in front of her, writing in it with a focused intensity that made her entirely unaware of the rest of the room. Reuben watched her, not in a rude way, but in the way you watch something that interests you without yet understanding why. She wrote for a long time, pausing occasionally to look out the window with an expression that was hard and considering, as though she was working out a problem that the street outside was not helping her solve. He should have let it be. He should have finished his pie, paid Mrs. Albright, and gone back to the boarding house. Instead, he picked up his coffee, crossed the room, and said, "Miss Weston, I hope you don't mind company." She looked up at him, that careful expression again. But then she moved her journal to make room at the table, which he took as the invitation it was. "You are persistent," she said. "Curious," he corrected, sitting down. "There's a difference." "Is there?" Persistence is about wanting something. Curiosity is about understanding something. He set his coffee down. "I find myself curious about you." She regarded him for a moment. "You helped me yesterday," she said. "That was genuinely kind. But I should tell you plainly that I'm not looking for that. I'm in a complicated situation and I would not want to mislead you." "Tell me about the complicated situation," he said. She blinked. Clearly she had expected him to retreat, or to reassure her with some empty phrase, or to do what men generally did when a woman told them something was complicated. "That's a forward thing to ask," she said. "I suppose it is," he agreed. "You don't have to answer it, but I'm a fair judge of people, and whatever your situation is, I think you're handling it with considerable courage, and that's worth knowing." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her seemed to make a decision, the way ice makes a decision to melt, not all at once, but unmistakably. "I am traveling to Abilene," she said. "I have a position secured there as a bookkeeper for a merchant. I left a situation in Missouri 4 months ago that was not safe for me." She paused. "That is as much as I'm prepared to say." "That's enough," Reuben said. They talked for an hour after that about nothing in particular. The weather on the trail, the state of the cattle market, a book she was reading that he had never heard of, a town in Missouri he had passed through once. Easy conversation, the kind that felt like something had always existed between them and was only now being uncovered layer by layer. She was sharp and funny in a dry way that snuck up on you. She asked good questions. When she disagreed with something he said, she said so directly, without the softening that some women employed when they were not sure if a man could handle a contrary opinion. Reuben found himself entirely captivated. When they finally stood to leave, he walked her out to the street, and in the amber light of the late afternoon, with the dust of Caldwell settling around them and the sounds of the stockyard carrying faintly on the breeze, he said, "I would like to see you again tomorrow if you're willing." She tilted her head. "You leave for Texas in 2 days." "I know it," he said. "That doesn't leave much time for anything sensible." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." She studied him for a moment, that careful look again, but warmer now. "The park near the depot at noon," she said. "I'll be there until 1 o'clock," and she walked away before he could answer. The next morning Reuben woke up at 5 o'clock, which was his habit from the trail, and lay in his boarding house bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about Claire Weston. He thought about her handwriting in that journal, which had been small and even and certain. He thought about the way she had described the Missouri situation as not safe without any drama or self-pity, just a plain statement of fact. He thought about the scar at her eyebrow and the way her voice dropped slightly when she was saying something she considered important. He realized with the calm clarity of a man who had always been honest with himself, already more than halfway in love with her. And he had known her for 2 days, and he did not know a single thing about her real life. And she was heading to Abilene, and he was heading to Texas, and none of that changed anything about the fact that when he was in the same room with her, the rest of the world became considerably less interesting. He met her at noon at the park near the depot. She was sitting on a bench under a cottonwood tree reading her book, and she had a lunch pail beside her which turned out to contain biscuits and salt pork, and 2 small jars of preserved plums that she had gotten from the boarding house kitchen. They ate together on the bench while a group of children ran noisily around the edges of the park, and the Kansas wind moved through the cottonwood leaves with a sound like distant applause. He told her about his life, really told her. in the way he rarely told anyone. He told her about growing up in Ohio, the second son of a farmer who had no patience for second sons. He told her about coming west at 17 with $30 and a stubborn disposition. He told her about the years of working up through every level of the cattle trade, from wrangler to trail hand to scout to boss. He told her about the loneliness of the trail, which was a particular kind of loneliness that came from being responsible for everything and being able to share that weight with no one. She listened with the full, quiet attention of someone who understood what it meant to carry weight alone. She told him a little more about herself. She was 27. She had been educated at a school in St. Louis until she was 18. She had a brother somewhere in California whom she had not seen in 5 years. She liked mathematics and horses and thunderstorms. She had come west, she paused here, measuring her words because the life she had been living in Missouri had stopped being hers, and she had needed to reclaim it. "I've been calling myself Claire Weston for 4 months, she said, watching a sparrow land on the path in front of them. I needed a name that no one was looking for. Reuben looked at her. That sounds like a person running from something specific, he said. A person, she said carefully, who had a husband who believed that what was his could not become not his, and a brother-in-law who agreed with him. She kept her voice level, but her hands were still in her lap in a way that was not relaxed. The marriage was not a good marriage, and when I left without their permission, which they did not consider legal. In a civilized country, Reuben said with a controlled quietness, a woman should not need permission to leave something that harms her. In the country we actually have, she said, it is more complicated. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, is there something keeping you from Abilene, someone following you? I don't believe I was followed, she said. But I was careful. I changed directions twice. I was in a town in Nebraska for 6 weeks before I came south. She finally looked at him directly. I am telling you this because you have been kind and you deserve to know that there is a complication attached to knowing me. I appreciate your honesty, he said. Most people would have stood up and wished me well, she said. I'm not most people, he said. They sat in silence for a moment. The cottonwood leaves moved. The children shouted somewhere behind them. The railroad depot on the far side of the park hissed quietly with steam. What is your real name? Reuben asked. She looked at him for a long moment. I'll tell you someday, she said. Not today. All right, he said. And then, because Reuben Doyle was a man who trusted his instincts the way he trusted the ground under his horse's feet, not because he could prove they were right, but because he had learned the hard way that they almost always were, he turned to her on that bench and said the thing that had been forming in the back of his mind since the previous afternoon. I know this is going to sound completely unreasonable, he said. Then perhaps you should say it anyway, she said, with that dry almost smile. I don't want to go to Abilene and have you become someone I almost knew, he said. I don't want to ride back to Texas and spend the next year thinking about a woman in a park in Caldwell whose real name I didn't get to know. He paused. I know we have met twice. I know I don't know your full story, but I know enough to know I want to hear the rest of it. He reached into the pocket of his coat and he pulled out a small silver ring that he had purchased that morning from the jeweler on 2nd Street, because Reuben Doyle, when he decided something, did not believe in half measures. I don't expect you to say yes. I expect you to say no and think I've lost my mind. But I want you to know that I mean it when I say I would like very much to marry you, if you'll have me. The silence that followed was the most complete silence Reuben had ever experienced outside of a windless night on the open plain. She was staring at the ring in his palm. Then she looked up at him, and her expression was something he had not yet seen on her face, a complicated layering of emotions that moved through her eyes like weather, and none of it was mockery or amusement at his expense. Reuben, she said quietly, you do not know my name. I know you, he said. The name is a detail. It is not a detail, she said. And besides, I am legally married to another man. I cannot, she stopped. This is the kindest foolish thing anyone has ever done in front of me. She closed his fingers over the ring gently, both her hands around his. But I cannot say yes to this. I know it, he said. I'm not asking you to say yes today. I'm asking you to hold on to the idea of it, while I figure out how to not let you become someone I almost knew." She looked at him for a long time. Her hands were still over his. "You are a very strange man," she said. "I've been told that," he said. When they parted an hour later, he watched her walk away and felt something settle in his chest, some restless thing that had been moving for years finding a place to be still. He had proposed to a woman whose real name he did not know. She had turned him down with the most tender refusal he had ever received, and he was not even slightly discouraged. The next morning he rode south toward Texas, and he thought about her the whole way. He wrote her a letter. This was not as simple as it sounded, because he did not have an address for her beyond the merchant in Abilene, whose name she had mentioned was a Mr. Thaddeus Harwick, and he did not know if a letter addressed to Miss Claire Weston at the Harwick Mercantile, Abilene, Kansas, would actually reach her. But he wrote it anyway, because writing it felt necessary, and he sent it from a post office in a small town in Oklahoma Territory with more hope than certainty. The drive he returned to was a long one, cattle from the Edwards Plateau destined for a buyer in Dodge City, which was the busier of the two terminal towns now that the cattle routes had shifted in the last few years. The drive took 11 weeks and required everything Reuben had, because the weather was contrary and 2 of his hands quit at the Red River, and the replacement men he hired were inexperienced and needed to be taught basic things at inconvenient times. He worked from before sunrise to well after dark every day for 11 weeks, and still, in the margins of those days, he thought about Claire Weston, about the way she had placed her hands over his to close his fingers around the ring, about the way she had said kindest foolish thing. He arrived in Dodge City in early August and went immediately to the post office, more out of habit than expectation. There was a letter waiting for him. The handwriting on the envelope was small and even and certain. He stood in the middle of the post office and read it right there, which was something he never did with correspondence, preferring privacy. But he could not wait. She wrote well, with an economy and precision that made each sentence feel considered. She had arrived safely in Abilene. The position with Mr. Harwick was satisfactory. She had a room at a respectable boarding house run by a Mrs. Connolly who reminded her of a very opinionated hen. She was well. She did not write about Missouri or about her husband or about anything that could identify her, but she wrote at the end, "I have been thinking about the park in Caldwell. I find that I am glad you are somewhere in the world." Reuben folded the letter very carefully and put it in his inside coat pocket. Then he sat down on a bench outside the post office and spent a considerable amount of time watching the street and feeling something that he supposed was happiness. He wrote back that same evening. He wrote 4 pages, which was more than he had written in a letter since. Actually, he was not sure he had ever written 4 pages to anyone. He told her about the drive. He told her about a thunderstorm they had ridden through in Indian Territory that had been the most magnificent thing he had seen in years, lightning in every direction, and the cattle strangely calm through it all. He told her he had kept the silver ring in his coat pocket, and that it had survived the entire drive without incident, which he chose to regard as an omen. He sent the letter, and then went to work on the problem that needed solving if anything between himself and this woman was ever going to be possible. He knew a lawyer in Dodge City, a man named Gerald Penn, who had an office above the dry goods store and who specialized in the kinds of legal complications that were particular to the frontier. Reuben sat down with Gerald Penn the following morning and laid out the situation as plainly as he could without using the woman's actual name: married woman in Missouri, husband who considered her his property, woman who had left for reasons of safety. Gerald Penn listened carefully and then explained, equally carefully, that the legal landscape here was genuinely complicated. In Missouri, the husband would have legal standing over the marriage and potentially over the wife's property. However, if the woman had been absent for a sufficient period and the husband had not actively pursued legal dissolution, there were avenues, particularly if grounds of cruelty could be established and documented. It would require a lawyer in the relevant jurisdiction, documentation of the circumstances of the marriage, and time. It would not be fast or simple. How long? Reuben asked. Could be a year, Gerald Penn said. Could be 2. Depends on the circumstances and whether the husband contests. Reuben thought about this. If the husband is the kind of man who doesn't give up things he considers his, he said, he'll contest. Then plan for 2 years, Gerald Penn said. Possibly more. Reuben nodded slowly. 2 years was a long time. It was also, in the larger accounting of a life, not very long at all. All right, he said. What do I need to do? He corresponded with her for 8 months through the letters, which became the anchoring points of his weeks. Her letters were careful at first, warm but measured, as though she was still deciding how much to trust the warmth she was feeling. But they became longer over time, and more personal, and occasionally funny in the dry, precise way that her conversation was funny. She told him about Abilene, which was a more settled town than Caldwell now that the great cattle drives had moved westward, but still had more than its share of characters. She told him about Mr. Harwick, who was a decent employer but believed that women should not have opinions about business matters, a belief she was slowly and diplomatically correcting. She told him about Mrs. Connolly's boarders, a rotating cast of merchants and travelers, and one very dignified former schoolteacher named Miss Abbott who had come west at 52 to see what all the fuss was about. She did not tell him her real name. He asked once in the 6th month of letters, gently, without pressure. He wrote, "When you're ready to tell me, I'm ready to hear it." She did not answer that part directly, but her next letter was the longest she had written, and the last line was, "I am beginning to believe that you mean what you say, Reuben Doyle. That is a strange and not unpleasant thing to realize." In February of 1883, she wrote to tell him that she had spoken with a lawyer of her own, a woman's advocate she had been put in contact with through a network she described only as trustworthy people who help women in difficult circumstances. The lawyer had made initial inquiries in Missouri. Her husband's name was a man called Harlan Graves, and here Reuben noticed that the store owner in Caldwell had also been named Graves, and understood that she had used the name on the receipt as a false surname when she had given herself to him as Claire Weston. The coincidence was intentional. It had been the nearest surname available to her in a moment when she needed one. Harlan Graves was a prosperous man in his county who had a reputation for respectability, and who had apparently told the community she had gone to visit a sick relative. He had not made public the fact of her departure. This was either good news or bad news, her lawyer had explained, depending on how you looked at it. Good news because he had not sent anyone actively searching for her in the way that some men did. Bad news because it meant he was either confident she would return or was waiting and watching in a way that was harder to see coming. Reuben read this letter 3 times, each time feeling a protective anger that he had to carefully manage into something useful. He wrote back with information about Gerald Penn and what Penn had told him about the legal avenues, and suggested the 2 lawyers might correspond directly if the woman was agreeable. She was agreeable. He arrived in Abilene in March of 1883. He had not told her he was coming. The drive he had just finished had delivered cattle to a buyer in Wichita, and Abilene was not far, and he had a week before he needed to be anywhere. He had written from Wichita to say he was coming, but the letter and his person arrived in Abilene within hours of each other, which meant when he walked into the Harwick Mercantile on a Tuesday morning in early spring. She was standing behind the counter working on a ledger, and she looked up, and there was a moment, just a moment, where every careful, measured quality about her simply dropped away, and what replaced it was purely glad. "You wrote that you were coming," she said. "I wrote it very recently," he said. "I got the letter 20 minutes ago," she said. "I know I was almost hoping to beat it," he said, stepping up to the counter. "I thought the element of surprise might what?" she said, and there was something alive in her voice now, something bright. Might show me what your face looks like when you're not prepared to manage it, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, I think you just did. They had dinner that evening at the only restaurant in Abilene that could be called respectable, and it was the first time they had sat across a table from each other since the pie shop in Caldwell 11 months ago, and the conversation that had always felt easy in letters became even easier in person, and Reuben thought, this is it. This is the exact center of the whole thing. This is what I have been moving toward since before I knew what I was moving toward. He was in Abilene for 5 days. On the second day, they walked along the river in the afternoon, and she told him more about her life in Missouri. Not the bad parts, not yet, but the life she had had before the marriage had soured. She had been a teacher's aide at a school. She had loved it. She had been good at it. She had married Harlan Graves at 21, which she described as the mistake of a young woman who had understood intelligence as a substitute for wisdom and discovered too late that they were not the same thing. He wasn't a bad man at first, she said. Or perhaps he was and I couldn't see it. But he believed very completely that a wife was a thing to be owned, and when I started to have opinions about my own life, he considered that a kind of insubordination. That is not marriage, Reuben said. No, she agreed. It isn't. On the third day she let him take her hand while they walked, and he was careful with it, holding it the way you hold something that matters. On the fourth day he asked her, sitting on the wooden steps of the boarding house in the evening with the stars coming up over the Kansas plain, whether she thought she could ever be happy again. She was quiet for a long time. I am happy now, she said. Right now, this moment. I know it might not last, and I know there are still things to be resolved, but right now, yes. She looked at him. I find that I am frightened of being happy because I have been taught by experience to wait for it to be taken. I won't take it from you, he said. You can't promise that, she said. Nobody can promise that. I can promise that I will never be the cause of it being taken, he said. I can promise you that anything you feel with me will be yours to feel and you'll never need permission for it. She looked at him for a long time in the blue evening light. That's a better promise, she said. He left on the 5th day, back toward Texas and the next drive, and he spent the journey thinking about lawyers and 2 years and the way she had been purely glad to see him and had not quite been able to hide it. The letters continued. The lawyers corresponded. The wheels of the legal process turned with the slow, grinding patience of something that was not built for urgency. In the summer of 1883, he was in Caldwell again with another drive, and he walked past the park near the depot and thought about her so specifically that he could almost hear the cottonwood leaves. He bought dried apple pie at Mrs. Albright's and ate it alone at the table where they had sat and felt the sweetness of missing someone who was also, somewhere, real and alive and thinking about him. He was certain of this because she had told him so in a letter that spring. She had written, I think about you with a frequency that I did not anticipate and cannot entirely account for by logic. I find this alarming and also, increasingly, not alarming at all. In the fall of 1883, the news from Missouri was bad. Her lawyer wrote to Gerald Penn, and then Gerald Penn wrote to Reuben, and then Reuben rode to Abilene as fast as he sensibly could. Harlan Graves had learned, somehow, through what avenue they never fully determined, that his wife was in Kansas. He had hired a man to find her. He had also filed papers in Missouri asserting his marital rights and claiming that she had abandoned the marriage without cause. The woman met Reuben at the Harwick Mercantile on the morning after he arrived, and she was calm in the way that a person becomes calm when they have already been very frightened and worked through it. I won't go back, she said immediately. Nobody is asking you to go back, Reuben said, but we need to think carefully about what happens next. Her lawyer had advised moving. Not running. She had done enough of that, but relocating to somewhere where she was less known, and where any man looking for a woman named Claire Weston would find the trail going cold. The lawyer had also written to a judge in Kansas who had sympathies for women in these circumstances, and who might be willing to hear a divorce petition on grounds of abandonment. If the case were properly constructed, and Graves could be shown to have driven her to leave through his conduct. "The problem," Reuben said, sitting across from her in the small back office of the Mercantile where Mr. Harwick had discreetly allowed them to speak, "is that proving conduct requires you to go on record about things you've been keeping private, and it requires using your real name." She looked at the desk in front of her. Her hands were folded carefully in her lap. "My real name," she said, "is Catherine Wilcox. Wilcox was my family name before Graves." She looked up at him. "I have not said that name out loud in almost 2 years." Reuben said it back to her. "Catherine Wilcox." Something moved through her expression, something that looked like the small, careful relief of a thing long locked up being unlocked. "It sounds like a person I used to know," she said. "It sounds like the person you are," he said. He held her gaze for a moment. He thought about the park in Caldwell, about the ring in his coat pocket that had traveled with him through 11 cattle drives and 200 miles of correspondence. He had proposed to Claire Weston on a bench in Kansas without knowing her name. Now he knew it. "I told you in Caldwell," he said, "that your name was a detail." "You did," she said. "I want to say it again now that I know it." He looked at her steadily. "Catherine, it doesn't change a single thing." Her eyes filled just slightly at the corners, and she blinked it back with the discipline of someone who had learned not to cry in situations where she needed to be clear-headed. "You are consistent," she said. "When it matters," he said. "This matters," she said quietly. "I know it does," he said. They sat in that back office for a long time, talking through the practical realities. Gerald Penn had a recommendation about a lawyer in Topeka who had more experience with these specific cases. Moving to Topeka would put her further from Abilene, and from any information Graves's man might have gathered. It would also require her to leave the position at Harwick's, which she had held for nearly 2 years, and which had provided her stability and a measure of security. "I've been saving," she said. "I have enough to last 6 months without work if I'm careful." "You won't need 6 months," Reuben said. "The lawyer in Topeka thinks 12 to 18 months for the full process, if things proceed without major obstacles." "Graves will make obstacles," she said. "Graves will make obstacles," Reuben agreed. "But Gerald Penn thinks the Kansas jurisdiction argument is solid and the documentation your lawyer has gathered is substantial." He paused. "There's something else I want to say." She waited. "I want to be present for this," he said. "I don't mean I'll be in Topeka every day, the drives won't allow that, but I want to be part of it, not just as a letter writer. I want to be the person standing beside you when the hard parts happen." He reached into his coat pocket. He laid the silver ring on the desk between them. "I proposed to you when I didn't know your name. I propose again now that I do. Catherine Wilcox, when you are free to say yes, I am going to ask you again properly, and I need you to know that my answer will be the same whether you're Wilcox or Weston or any other name you've ever had to be." She looked at the ring on the desk. "That's the second time," she said. "Yes, it is," he said. "You proposed to me before you knew my name," she said slowly. "And now you've proposed again knowing it." "And I mean it exactly the same amount both times," he said. She picked up the ring. She turned it in her fingers, looking at it. Then she set it down again, but she did not push it back to him. "When I'm free," she said, "ask me again then." "I will," he said. And he believed her, and she believed him, and that was enough for the moment. She moved to Topeka in November of 1883, and Reuben helped her move, driving a hired wagon with her belongings from Abilene in a day and a half across the Kansas autumn. The plains burned gold and amber around them, and the sky so clear and wide it seemed to be showing off. They talked the entire way, which surprised neither of them, and stopped for the night at a small roadside inn where they were given separate rooms and ate supper at a long table with half a dozen other travelers, and a family with 3 very loud small boys who climbed on everything. Catherine was better with the children than Reuben expected. She redirected the youngest away from a hot stove with a calm efficiency that suggested she had done this sort of thing before, and then engaged him in a conversation about horses that occupied him completely for the rest of the meal. Reuben watched her and felt that thing again, that settling, that rightness. After supper, they sat on the inn's porch in the cold air and watched the stars, which were extravagant over the Kansas plain in a way that always made Reuben feel that the world was, at its core, generous. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," she said. He thought about it seriously because she meant it seriously. "When I was 19 and working my first real drive," he said, "we lost a steer in a river crossing. The Red River coming out of Texas. The man in front of me, older hand, been on the trail 20 years, didn't try to save it. Just let it go. And afterward I asked him why, and he said, you can't save everything that crosses water. And I thought about that for years as though it were wise, and then one day I realized I had been using it as an excuse not to try." He paused. "Since then I try, even when the river's high." She was quiet for a moment. "That is a very good thing to know about you," she said. He looked at her. "Your turn." She was silent for longer. The cold was real now, their breath visible in small clouds. "When I was hiding in Nebraska," she said, "there was a week when I almost went back. Not because I wanted to, because I was so tired. Because being free was harder than I had imagined in ways I had not imagined." She paused. "And the thing that stopped me was," she hesitated, "it was a letter you had sent from somewhere in Oklahoma Territory that I had with me. I read it in that room in Nebraska, and it reminded me that there were people in the world who thought about you as a person rather than a possession." She looked at him. "I don't think I've told you that before." He was very still. "I'm glad the letter existed," he said finally. "So am I," she said. They arrived in Topeka the following day, and he helped her settle into a room at a boarding house on a quiet street, and he spent 2 days with her helping her navigate the new city, and meeting the lawyer whose name was Philip Arnott, a serious and methodical man who had spent 15 years untangling exactly this kind of legal knot, and who, Reuben was relieved to find, clearly believed that the justice of the cause mattered as much as the legal strategy. Reuben rode south and west again for the next drive, carrying the image of her standing in the doorway of the Topeka boarding house, waving goodbye with a calm that he now knew was not indifference, but simply the way she absorbed things fully, without letting them overflow. The winter was long and the letters kept coming. They had established a kind of language in their letters by now, a shorthand of references and callbacks that made each letter feel like a continuing conversation, rather than a series of discrete communications. She wrote about Philip Arnott's progress, which was slow, methodical, and encouraging in the way that a thing built solidly is encouraging, even when it doesn't move fast. She wrote about Topeka, which was a more substantial city than Caldwell or Abilene, with proper buildings and a state house, and a level of civic organization that she found both comforting and slightly suffocating after years of frontier life. She was working again, as a bookkeeper for an insurance office, because she could not sit idle, and because the additional income made her feel less like someone waiting to be saved and more like herself. He wrote back about the drives, about the Texas ranch country, about the way the winter light on the Edwards Plateau was a different quality than the light anywhere else he had been. He wrote about the ring. He wrote that he had a good friend, a fellow trail boss named Samuel Oakes, who had been married for 12 years and still talked about his wife with the same specific affection people reserved for things that had surprised them by being even better than expected, and that Reuben found himself wanting exactly that. In March of 1884, there was a setback. Harlan Graves had engaged a Missouri lawyer, and that lawyer had filed counterpapers in Missouri, asserting that the Kansas proceedings were invalid because the marriage had been contracted in Missouri and the parties were Missouri residents, and requesting that any and all proceedings be transferred to Missouri jurisdiction, where the outcome would almost certainly favor Graves. Philip Arnott wrote to Catherine explaining this in legal terms. Catherine wrote to Reuben in plain terms. Reuben rode to Topeka the following week. He found her at her desk at the insurance office, working with the focused intensity she applied to everything. She looked up when he came in the door, and relief crossed her face in a way she did not bother to manage, and that alone was worth the 3-day ride. "Philip Arnott is optimistic," she said when they were outside. "Good," Reuben said. "Tell me why." "Because Kansas has legal grounds to retain jurisdiction based on my residence here, which I have now established for over a year." She had clearly been listening closely to Philip Arnott. "And because there is a precedent from 1879, a case in which a Kansas court retained jurisdiction over a divorce petition despite Missouri objections, where the wife had established bona fide Kansas residency." She paused. "But Graves is not going to stop. Philip says he will find another avenue after this one." "Graves is used to winning by making things too difficult to fight," Reuben said. "He's counting on you running out of resources or spirit." "I know," she said. "You haven't," he said. "I know that too," she said, with a firm quietness that he loved completely. "He was in Topeka for 8 days. He met with Philip Arnott himself to understand the full legal picture, and then he did something that he had been considering for several months. He transferred a significant portion of his savings, accumulated over years of trail bosses' wages and careful spending, into an account designated for legal costs, with a letter to Philip Arnott authorizing the use of these funds as necessary. He did not tell Catherine about this directly. He told Philip Arnott that if and when the question of continuing costs arose, this resource existed. He did not want Catherine to feel that her freedom was being purchased by someone else. He wanted her to feel that a friend had ensured she would not have to fight with one hand tied. He also spent those 8 days simply being with her, in the ways that had become comfortable and natural, walking in the evenings, eating at the small restaurant near the insurance office where the owner made very acceptable stew, sitting in the parlor of the boarding house after dark, reading separately and occasionally reading passages aloud to each other from whatever they were reading. This last had become a habit that started from practicality. She had a book, and he had finished his, and she had offered to share, and had become one of his favorite parts of any time spent together, because of the specific pleasure of hearing her voice reading words she found worth sharing. On the last evening before he left, sitting in the boarding house parlor with the fire burning low and the other residents already retired for the night, she reached across the small table between their chairs and put her hand over his. "I need you to know," she said, not looking at him but at the fire, that I am quite deeply in love with you. I have been for some time. I have been slow to say it because it seemed important not to say it while there is still a legal tie to another man. It seemed disorderly. He turned his hand over under hers and held it. "Catherine," he said. She looked at him then. "I have been in love with you since a pie shop in Caldwell, Kansas," he said. "Probably before that, if I'm honest. I was gone from the first afternoon in the park." He paused. "I have been carrying that around for 18 months, and it has not diminished by 1/fraction of a degree." She smiled then, a full smile, not the almost smile he had learned to read, but a real one that transformed her face entirely and made her look like someone who had been let out of a small room into a large one. "Good," she said. "That is good." "Yes, it is," he said. He held her hand until the fire went out and the room cooled and the night deepened around them, and neither of them felt any urgency to move. He left the next morning, and the leaving was harder than any leaving that had come before, because love named is a heavier thing than love unnamed, and he carried it all the way south to Texas, and it made the empty plane feel less empty. The summer of 1884 brought a development that Philip Arnott had hoped for and worked toward. The Missouri court ruled that Kansas had proper jurisdiction over Catherine's residency, and the petition could proceed in Kansas. Harlan Graves's Missouri lawyer filed an appeal, but Philip Arnott had anticipated this and had his response prepared before the appeal was formally entered. In September, Graves made a different kind of move. A man came to the insurance office where Catherine worked and asked for her under her real name, Catherine Graves, which was the name she had been under in Missouri. The office manager, confused, had said no one by that name worked there. The man had left. Catherine had come home to the boarding house that evening to find that someone had been asking questions of her landlady as well, also using the name Catherine Graves. She wrote to Reuben immediately. He was on a drive in Indian Territory, and the letter reached him in Dodge City when he came through at the end of October. He wrote back the same day, and also sent a telegram to Philip Arnott asking what protections could be put in place. Philip Arnott's response was that legally, Graves's man was doing nothing strictly illegal. Asking questions was not illegal. But the intent was clearly intimidation, and it was also potentially useful to the case, because it demonstrated that Graves considered Catherine's departure an ongoing grievance he was pursuing through extra-legal means, which spoke to the circumstances of the marriage. Reuben went to Topeka at the end of October, which was becoming something close to a habit by now. The trail would bring him north, and north was where she was, and he would go to her as the needle of a compass goes to north, not because it decides to, but because it cannot not. He arrived to find her calm and certain and not frightened. This quality in her, the ability to face difficult things without diminishing, was one of the things he had come to love most completely about her, because he understood that it was not absence of feeling but the disciplined management of it, a strength built from necessity that had become genuine. "I want to know something," she said, on the evening he arrived when they were walking along the street in the sharp October cold. "Ask it," he said. "You have been coming to Topeka and writing letters and speaking with my lawyer and being consistent in the way that you are for almost 2 years now." She walked with her hands in her coat pockets, her breath making small clouds. "What does your life look like after, when this is resolved? What do you actually want?" He thought about it carefully because she deserved a careful answer. "I want a piece of land," he said. "Not too large. I've been looking here and there at what's available in Kansas because I've come to think Kansas is where I want to be. Good grass, reliable water, close enough to the railroad for the cattle market." He paused. "I want to stop trailing other men's herds and start building something of my own. I've been saving toward that for 3 years. He looked at her. "And I want you to be part of deciding what it looks like, because I don't want a life that I hand you and say, 'Here, fit yourself into this.' I want to build the shape of it together." She was quiet for a moment. "You've thought about the land specifically," she said. "I've had a lot of time on the trail to think," he said. "Where in Kansas?" "There's a stretch south of Topeka, about 30 miles, near a town called Burlingame. Limestone Hills country, good grass." He paused. "I haven't committed to it. I wanted to know your thoughts first." She looked at him sideways. "You are a thoughtful man," she said. "I try to be," he said. "I've never had the consideration of my opinion about a piece of land was not something my previous marriage offered," she said carefully. "The idea of it is somewhat overwhelming." "You'll get used to it," he said. "I suspect I will," she said, and she said it in a way that meant, "I want to." Philip Arnott's case moved forward through the winter of 1884 and into the spring of 1885. Graves's appeal was rejected by the Kansas court in February. His Missouri lawyer made one final filing in March, which Philip Arnott described in a letter to Catherine as a last, somewhat desperate attempt that the court would almost certainly not entertain. On a Tuesday in May of 1885, 3 weeks before Catherine's 30th birthday, Philip Arnott summoned her to his office to read her a document. The divorce was granted. Catherine came out of Philip Arnott's office on a Tuesday afternoon in May and walked the 3 blocks to the small park near the insurance office where she sometimes ate her lunch. She sat on a bench. The spring was everywhere, the grass new and startling green, the trees in full leaf, the air carrying warmth and the smell of things growing. She sat for a very long time and felt the exact weight of what had been set down. She had written to Reuben 3 weeks earlier that the final ruling was expected any day. He was somewhere in Texas. She had the ranch address he used as a home base. She reached into her coat pocket and found paper and a pencil, which she always carried, and she wrote him 3 words on the paper: "It is done." She folded it and addressed it and walked it to the post office herself before she went back to work. Reuben received her letter on a Saturday. He had already been planning to come north. He had a drive finished, a ranch to look at south of Burlingame, and a ring in his coat pocket that had been there for 2.5 years. The letter made him saddle his horse that same afternoon. He rode into Topeka on a Wednesday evening in late May, dusty from the road and sun-brown and completely unhesitating, and went directly to the boarding house on the quiet street and knocked on the door. Mrs. Connolly's replacement in Topeka, a Mrs. Garland who was nearly as opinionated, answered the door and called up the stairs. Catherine came down. She was wearing a blue dress that he had not seen before, the blue of deep water, and her dark hair was loose around her shoulders rather than pinned up, and she was looking at him in the way that she had looked at him from across the room when he had walked into the Harwick Mercantile in Abilene 2 years ago, that purely glad look, unmanaged and real and the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "You rode fast," she said. "I had a letter that made riding fast seem sensible," he said. She came down the last 2 steps and they stood in the front hallway of the boarding house looking at each other. And there was so much between them, 2.5 years of letters and visits and longing, and the slow grinding work of justice. And none of it needed saying, because they both knew it in the same way that you know what has grown in a garden by looking at what has come up. He reached into his coat pocket. The silver ring was there, as it had been for 2.5 years. Through 11 cattle drives and 1,000 miles of trail and 1 lawsuit and 2 proposals and a park in Caldwell and a boarding house in Abilene and a back office in Topeka. He did not drop to one knee in the hallway because the hallway was narrow and Mrs. Garland was clearly still within earshot. He held the ring between his fingers and he looked at Catherine Wilcox and he said, in a voice pitched for her alone, "I proposed to you before I knew your name. I proposed again when I learned it. I told you both times that the name didn't change a single thing. This is the 3rd time, and I want you to know that everything I have said and meant in the last 2.5 years is contained in this question." He paused. "Catherine Wilcox, will you marry me?" She took the ring from his fingers. She looked at it for a moment with the same expression she had had in the back office in Abilene when she had first heard her name said back to her, that small, careful relief, that unlocking. Then she looked at him and said, "Yes." And Reuben Doyle, who had been patient and persistent and consistent through 2.5 years of loving a woman across impossible distances and legal obstacles, and a silence about her own name that she had needed to keep to stay safe, allowed himself to feel every single moment of that time as the weight it had been, and then let it go completely, because she had said yes, and the rest of it could go back to the earth it had come from. He put the ring on her finger. It fit. He had had it sized in Caldwell by the jeweler who had made it, based on the only measurement available to him, the memory of her hands closing over his on a park bench, which was not a precise measurement but had, apparently, been close enough. Mrs. Garland appeared in the hallway doorway and attempted to look as though she had not been listening. "Will you be staying for dinner, Mr. Doyle?" she asked with the particular brightness of a person who knows exactly what has just happened. "I would be grateful," Reuben said, without looking away from Catherine. They were married in Topeka on a Saturday in June of 1885, in the parlor of Philip Arnett's home, which Philip Arnett had offered because it was larger than the boarding house and had a garden that was at its best in June. The ceremony was performed by a justice of the peace named Abbott, no relation to Miss Abbott of Abilene, Catherine confirmed, which was a funny coincidence. In the presence of Philip Arnett, his wife, Mrs. Garland, Mr. Harwick, who had come up from Abilene because Catherine had written to tell him, and he had decided the trip was worth making, and Samuel Oakes, Reuben's old trail friend, who stood beside Reuben and looked at the whole scene with the specific satisfaction of a man who had known this was coming before either of the principal parties had fully admitted it to themselves. Catherine wore a dress of deep rose that she had made herself over 3 weeks, because she had wanted to make the thing she wore on this particular day rather than buy it. Reuben wore his best suit, which was not as fine as some suits but was clean and well-fitted, and he wore it with the ease of a man who was comfortable with himself. When the justice asked them to repeat their vows, Catherine spoke in a voice that was clear and steady and entirely unhesitant. Reuben spoke in a voice that was low and certain, and when he said the part about forsaking all others, he meant it in a way that had specifically personal weight for both of them, and they both knew it. They exchanged rings. She had bought him a simple iron band that she had inscribed on the inside with 2 words that he did not see until he slid it onto his finger and tilted it toward the light. It read "Say It," which was her reference to the moment in the boarding house hallway when he had pitched his voice low and asked the question he had been asking in various forms since a park bench in Caldwell in 1882. He looked at it and then looked at her, and she was watching him with that smile, the full one, and he thought, there is the rest of my life. They ate supper in Philip Arnott's garden, while the June evening settled around them like something that had always been meant to be this way, and Samuel Oakes made a toast that was heartfelt and only slightly embarrassing, and Mr. Harwick gave a speech that was more formal than necessary but genuinely warm, and Philip Arnott sat with his arm around his wife and watched the whole thing with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had used his particular skills to build something that mattered. After the celebration, Reuben and Catherine stayed for 2 nights at the Topeka Hotel that had been recommended to Reuben by Gerald Penn as the best in the city, and those 2 days were theirs entirely, no legal business, no drives, no correspondence, no obligations. Just the 2 of them in a city in June with everything ahead of them. On the second morning, Catherine sat up in bed with the early light coming through the curtains and looked at the ring on her finger, the silver ring that had lived in Reuben's coat pocket for 2.5 years, and then looked at Reuben, who was awake and watching her with the particular unhurried attention she had come to recognize as one of his most fundamental qualities. "I want to go see the land in Burlingame," she said. "Today," he said. "Next week," she said. "I want to see it before we decide." "Of course," he said. "I thought we'd go next week anyway." She looked at him. "You've been planning this for a while." "A while," he agreed. "How long have you been thinking about this specific land?" she asked. He considered this honestly. "About 14 months," he said. She shook her head slowly with an expression that was fond and slightly astonished in equal measure. 14 months, she said. "I wanted to have something concrete to offer," he said. "Not just an idea of a life, an actual place." "Reuben," she said. "Yes. You are the most deliberately thoughtful person I have ever known," she said. "It is remarkable." "Is that a good thing?" he said. "It is the best thing," she said. They went to Burlingame the following week, driving out in a hired buggy on a road that became gradually less road and more intention as they moved into the Limestone Hills country. The land Reuben had been watching for 14 months was 160 acres, with a creek that ran along the eastern boundary and good grass over most of it, and a modest existing structure, a 1-room cabin that had been built by a homesteader who had given up after 2 hard winters that could be made into something better with work and time. Catherine stood in the middle of the grass and turned in a slow circle, reading the landscape with those dark eyes that he had been reading for 3 years. The hills rolled green and gold around them, limestone outcroppings catching the afternoon light. The creek made itself heard as a low, continuous sound under everything. The sky over Kansas was doing its usual extravagant thing, wide and blue and going on forever. "There's water year-round," she said. "The creek has never dried in any year the previous owner recorded," he said. "The cabin is foundational," she said carefully. "The bones are good," he said. "We'd build it up considerably." She walked to the creek and looked at it for a long time. She walked back to the cabin and looked at that. She walked to the high point of the property, a gentle rise to the northwest, and stood there looking out over the hills. Then she turned around and looked at him across the distance between them, and she nodded. The land became theirs in July of 1885. Reuben did 1 more cattle drive that fall. He had made a commitment to the rancher in Texas before the summer, and he honored it, but it was his last drive working for someone else's cattle, and he told Samuel Oakes so over a fire in Indian Territory the night before they reached Dodge City with the herd. "About time," Samuel said. "I've been saying myself up," Reuben said. "For 2.5 years," Samuel said, with a sideways look that contained the entire history of the correspondence he had watched Reuben conduct. "Something like that," Reuben agreed. He was back in Burlingame by November, and the building began. Catherine had not waited for him to return to start. She had hired 2 men from the town, experienced builders, who had put up half of the houses in Burlingame's recent expansion. And by the time Reuben arrived, the cabin had been extended in 3 directions and had 2 real rooms and a proper fireplace and a loft. She had been supervising the construction herself, and had opinions about every aspect of it that she delivered with the directness he had always admired, and the structural knowledge she had apparently absorbed from 3 months of reading every available manual on practical carpentry. He stood in the doorway of the expanded structure and looked around at what had been made, and then looked at her standing in the middle of the room with sawdust on her sleeve and a measuring line in her hand, and felt the full weight of how much he loved her, which was not a new feeling but was, somehow, still capable of surprising him. "You did not leave anything for me to build," he said. "You can build the barn," she said. He built the barn. The winter of 1885 and 1886 was the first they spent in their house on the Burlingame land, and it was, in Reuben's private accounting, the best winter of his life. He was, for the first time since he was 17 years old, not moving toward anything, not traversing any territory that was not his own, not responsible for anything that was not also his personal care and pleasure. He was home, in the fullest sense of a word he had barely used in 15 years. Catherine set up a proper study for herself in one of the rooms, where she kept the ranch accounts with the meticulous precision she had always applied to numbers, and where she also kept her journal and her books, and the stack of letters that Reuben had written her over 3 years, which she had tied in bundles with kitchen twine. He found her there on many winter evenings, reading by the oil lamp with her feet tucked under her, and he would bring her tea and sit across from her and read something himself, and the parlor silence that they had first discovered in Topeka, the specific pleasure of being in the same room without needing to fill it with noise, was theirs every evening. They got cattle in the spring, a small starter herd, 20 head, from a rancher in the next county who was reducing his operation. Reuben knew cattle the way he knew his own hands, and the work of tending them on his own land was a different order of satisfaction than anything he had felt on the trail. He hired one hand to help, a young man named Pete Beaumont who was 18 and serious and learned fast, and taught him everything he knew about working cattle on a smaller operation. That spring Catherine went to see a lawyer in Topeka, a different one from Philip Arnott, about a specific legal matter she had been thinking about since the fall. She wanted to formally reestablish her name as Catherine Wilcox Doyle, her original name restored, her married name added. This was not complicated legally, and it was done within a month, and when she came home from Topeka with the documentation in her hands, she sat down at the kitchen table and read it over twice, and Reuben sat across from her and watched her read it. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Like finding a thing you thought was lost," she said. "And realizing it was just being kept somewhere safe." She looked up at him. "I have been Catherine Wilcox for longer than I was ever Catherine Graves," she said, "and I am Catherine Doyle now. I feel complete." "You are complete," he said. "You have always been complete. The paperwork is just catching up." She looked at him with that expression he had first seen on a park bench in Caldwell, that complicated layering of emotions that moved through her eyes like weather. "Come here," she said. He came around the table, and she stood up and put her arms around him in the way that was, after almost a year of marriage, entirely familiar and entirely new in the same breath. And he held her in the kitchen of their house on the Kansas limestone hills, with the spring coming through the window and the cattle visible in the south field, and the mountains of correspondence and legal difficulty and longing that had brought them here settled into the foundation of something permanent. "I love you," she said into his shoulder. "I have loved you since before I had enough safety to say it, and I intend to say it approximately every day for the rest of my life so that I make up the deficit." "You are not in deficit," he said, "but I will accept all future payments." She laughed, which was a sound he collected the way some men collect coins specifically, and with awareness of the particular worth of each one. In the fall of 1886, Catherine told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning in the kitchen, with the fall light coming in at a slant through the east window and the smell of coffee in the air. She said it plainly, without preamble, because she was constitutionally incapable of preamble when she had something important to say. And then she watched him absorb it with an expression that was a little like someone who had been waiting at a train station for a very long time and could now see the train in the distance. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and gathered her carefully into his arms, and then immediately was worried he had been too careful, and she laughed at the expression on his face and said, "I'm not fragile, Reuben." "I know you're not," he said. "You are the least fragile person I know." "Then hold me like it," she said. He held her properly, and they stood in the kitchen while the coffee went slightly past done, and the fall sun moved across the floor. The baby came in the spring of 1887, on a Thursday in April when the limestone hills were green after 3 days of rain. He was born with a quantity of dark hair and strong opinions about the inconvenience of the process, which he communicated at volume and at length. He was healthy. Catherine was well, and better than well. She was extraordinary, in Reuben's assessment, though she told him he was not an objective observer and was probably correct. They named him James Wilcox Doyle James for Reuben's father's father, who had been a man worth remembering, and Wilcox because Catherine wanted her family name to carry forward, and Doyle because he was emphatically his father's son in the shape of his jaw and the set of his dark eyes. Samuel Oakes came through Burlingame the following summer with his wife, Martha, who was warm and practical and took one look at Catherine and declared her an excellent woman, and then spent 3 days being excellent herself, while the men talked cattle and land, and the changing patterns of the Kansas livestock market. Martha held James while Catherine slept and declared him the finest baby of the current generation, which Catherine thanked her for warmly while acknowledging that Martha might be slightly biased. After the Oaks had gone south again, Catherine and Reuben sat on the porch in the August evening with James asleep inside, and the summer sky over the hills was putting on a last show of color before the dark came. "I want to tell you something I've been thinking about," Catherine said. "Tell me," he said. "I have been thinking about the school in Burlingame," she said. "The school teacher is leaving at the end of the term. I heard from Mrs. Patterson in town. And I was a teacher's aide in Missouri before everything. And I have been keeping accounts for 3 years, and I am good at that, and I will keep doing that, but I think," she paused, "I think I would like to teach." He looked at her in the fading light. She was watching him with that careful quality, as though she was not entirely sure what he would say, as though the habit of needing to gauge a man's reaction had not entirely left her. "Have you spoken to the school board?" he said. "Not yet," she said. "I wanted to tell you first." "Then speak to them," he said. "Tomorrow if you can manage it." The careful quality dropped away, replaced by that full smile. "You don't have reservations," she said. "My only reservation," he said, "is that the children of Burlingame are going to be extraordinarily well educated, which may create unrealistic expectations for the rest of the territory." She laughed and leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they watched the last color leave the sky over the limestone hills. Catherine Doyle, formerly Wilcox, formerly hiding under the name of a woman she had needed to be for a while, presented herself to the Burlingame School Board in September of 1887 with her credentials from Missouri and a demonstration lesson that left 2 of the 3 board members quite impressed and the 3rd one persuaded. She began teaching the following Monday. She was, as she had suspected herself to be, very good at it. The children of Burlingame found her demanding and entertaining, and occasionally startling in the precision of her expectations. And the word went through the town quickly that the new schoolteacher was someone to take seriously. Reuben heard this secondhand from Pete Beaumont, who had a younger sister in Catherine's class, and he heard it with the specific and private satisfaction of a man who has always known something and is now watching the rest of the world figure it out. James grew in the way of young children, quickly, and with complete disregard for his parents' ability to keep pace. He was a serious child, with a tendency toward very thorough investigation of anything that interested him, and a talent for asking questions at moments of maximum inconvenience. He had his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn chin, and an independent quality that both of them recognized as entirely inevitable given the source material. In the summer of 1889, Catherine was expecting again. This time she told him in the evening on the porch, and his response was considerably less worried and more simply, openly joyful, because he had learned from the first time that she was not fragile and that the appropriate response to good news was uncomplicated happiness. The second child was a girl, born in February of 1890, with red-brown hair that neither parent could entirely account for, and a temperament that was sunny where James was serious. They named her Eleanor, after a graytan of Catherine's who had been, Catherine said, the most interesting person in the family by a considerable margin, which was the greatest compliment Catherine had available. The ranch grew steadily through the years. Reuben added to the herd each spring, bringing it up from 20 head to 60 to 100, and hired another hand alongside Pete Beaumont, and built a second barn. And by 1891, the Doyle Ranch south of Burlingame was a recognized, viable enterprise. Not the largest in Osage County, but solid and well-run, and the kind of place that people pointed to when they talked about what a man could build in Kansas if he worked with discipline and wasn't too proud to learn. Catherine taught at the Burlingame School for 6 years, until the school's enrollment grew enough that the board hired a second teacher and offered Catherine the position of head teacher, which she accepted with the satisfaction of someone who had always intended to run things and had simply been waiting for the correct moment. She also, without making a particular announcement of it, began writing. Not the journal she had always kept, but letters to legal aid organizations that worked with women in circumstances like the one she had been in, women trapped by marriages they could not safely leave, women who had left and were being pursued, women who needed the kind of help that was hard to find if you did not know where to look. She had been helped by a network of such people, and she repaid it by becoming part of that network herself. She was careful and discreet, and she did not bring it into the house in any way that could affect the family, but Reuben knew about it because she told him, and he supported it because he understood exactly who she was and what she had needed, and what it cost people to keep such networks running. He told her this directly on an evening in the spring of 1892, sitting at the kitchen table after supper while James, who was 5 now and had been put to bed, had inevitably reappeared in the hallway under the impression that this fact could be negotiated. "What you are doing matters," Reuben said. "For the record." She looked at him across the table. "It doesn't cost you anything," she said. "The time, the correspondence, it costs me nothing," he said. "And it costs you something, and you do it anyway because that's who you are." He paused. "I want you to know I see it." She was quiet for a moment in the way that meant she was feeling something she was choosing to feel completely rather than quickly. "I see you too," she said, "in case that is not always apparent." "It is apparent," he said. James appeared in the kitchen doorway in his nightclothes, having determined that his presence was required. "James," Catherine said without turning around, "back to bed." "How did you know it was me?" James said. "Your footsteps sound like someone trying to be quiet," Reuben said. James appeared to find this useful information rather than discouraging, filed it away visibly, and retreated. Catherine turned back to Reuben, and they both held their expressions for exactly 2 seconds before laughing. The years from 1893 to 1897 built on everything that had come before. The children grew James into a quiet, deliberate boy of 10, and then 12 who had inherited his parents' capacity for hard work and his mother's talent for mathematics, and Alina into a bright, expansive girl who seemed genuinely unable to understand why anyone would want to be indoors when the limestone hills were right there. Pete Beaumont, their longtime hand, married a woman named Grace from the next town over in 1894, and Reuben gave him 2 acres of the north end of the property to build a small house on, because Pete had given the ranch 7 years, and Reuben was not a man who forgot that kind of loyalty. In 1895, Reuben and Catherine rode out one morning in October, just the 2 of them, leaving James and Alina in the care of a neighbor, and went to the high point of their property, the gentle rise to the northwest where Catherine had stood on the day they first walked the land, and turned to him and nodded. The hills were brown and gold in the October light. The creek could be heard below, lower than the spring but still running. The house and barns were visible to the south, compact and solid, 10 years of work made visible in weathered wood and limestone foundations. Reuben had brought a blanket, which he spread on the grass at the top of the rise, and a basket that Catherine recognized as Mrs. Garland's work, though Mrs. Garland was now in Topeka and far away. He had apparently arranged it with Grace Beaumont, who had a gift for food. They sat on the rise in the October warmth and ate, and were quiet together for a long time, the way they had always been good at being quiet together. "Do you remember," Catherine said, "that you told me in Topeka about the man on the cattle drive who said you can't save everything that crosses water, and how you had used it as an excuse not to try?" "I remember it," he said. "I have been thinking about that story for 13 years, she said. Every time something difficult came up, every time something seemed like it might be too much." She paused. "It is the best advice I have ever received. Even though you told it as a cautionary tale about yourself. You can't save everything that crosses water," he said, "but you can try." "But you can try," she agreed. She leaned into him, and he put his arm around her, and they looked out over the limestone hills that were theirs, over the house and the barns and the fields and the cattle moving slowly in the south pasture, over everything they had built from a park bench and a silver ring and the particular stubbornness of a man who had decided, on an afternoon in a pie shop in Caldwell, that this was the woman he intended to know. "I love you, Reuben Doyle," she said. "I love you, Catherine Doyle," he said. "I have loved you since before I knew your name, and I will love you considerably longer than it matters what your name is." She tilted her head back and looked at him. "That is almost exactly what you said to me in Caldwell," she said. "I mean it as much now," he said. "More." She put her hand against his face, and he turned into it slightly, and they stayed on the rise in the October light while the Kansas sky did its wide, extravagant thing above them, and the hills held them in the particular way that land holds people who have learned to belong to it. On the morning of their 10th wedding anniversary, in June of 1895, Catherine left a note on his pillow that read, "10 years ago, you put a ring on my finger that had been in your coat pocket for 2.5 years. I would like to think about what you carry in your pockets for the next 2.5 decades." He carried her letter in his coat pocket for a month before he wrote back, because writing back required finding the right words. When he did, he left the letter on her desk in the study, where she found it on a Tuesday evening while she was marking the school's examination papers. It was 1 page, and it said, among other things, "What I carry is this: the particular way you said yes in a boarding house hallway. The way you nodded on a hilltop in Burlingame, and I knew what it meant. The way you hold a child and do not look like someone performing tenderness, but like someone actually feeling it. The way you are never smaller than yourself. The way you have always been exactly who you are, even when you needed to be someone with a different name. I have been carrying all of this since a park bench in Caldwell, Kansas in the spring of 1882, and I will carry it without any weight felt as burden for however many years remain." She kept that letter in the bundle with the others, tied with kitchen twine. In the spring of 1897, James Wilcox Doyle, 12 years old and his father's son in the way that mattered most, came to Reuben in the barn on a Saturday morning and said, with the directness he had gotten from his mother, "I want to learn everything about running the ranch. Not just the parts you show me, everything." Reuben looked at his son for a moment, at the dark eyes and the stubborn jaw and the serious quality that would someday become authority if it was well tended. "All right," Reuben said. "We'll start Monday." They started Monday. Eleanor, 7 years old and constitutionally opposed to missing anything, demanded to start as well. Catherine, when consulted, said this was both inevitable and correct. Eleanor learned alongside her brother with a speed that occasionally embarrassed him, and that both parents noted privately and with profound satisfaction. The spring of 1898 brought the last significant disruption to the peace they had built. A letter arrived for Catherine from a lawyer in Missouri, not Graves's lawyer, but a different one, writing to inform her that Harlan Graves had died in December of 1897. He had died of pneumonia at 61 years of age, unmarried and leaving a contested estate. Catherine read the letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning and was quiet for a long time. "Are you all right?" Reuben said. "Yes," she said. "I am thinking about what I feel, which is more complicated than I expected." She paused. "I do not feel grief exactly. He made my life very small for a long time, and he did not stop trying to make it smaller after I left. But he was a person." She folded the letter. "I feel finished, in a way that I did not know I was still waiting to feel." "That seems like the right thing to feel," he said. "Is it strange," she said, "that I feel the most profound gratitude for the fact that you came across a street in Caldwell, Kansas, when a large man was being unreasonable about a receipt?" He thought about it seriously. "Not strange," he said. "That's where it started." "Where it started," she said. She looked at the letter one more time, then put it in the kitchen drawer where correspondence went to be dealt with and sometimes simply to be filed away. "I think I would like to ride out this morning," she said. "Will you come with me?" "Yes," he said. They rode out onto the limestone hills in the April morning, side by side on the horses they knew as well as they knew their own hands, and the spring was everywhere again. The grass new and startling green, the creek running high with the snowmelt, the sky carrying that particular quality of light that only existed at this time of year in this place. They rode to the top of the northwest rise, which was their place in the way that places become a couple's place, through return, through meaning, through the accumulation of important moments standing on the same ground. They stopped at the top and looked out over everything. The house stood solid and whitewashed in the morning light. The barns were full. The south pasture held 60 head of cattle moving in the slow, purposeful way of cattle that are well tended in content. The school in Burlingame was not visible from here, but was there, over the near hill, where today it was empty because it was Saturday, and next Monday Catherine would go back to it. Pete Beaumont's small house was visible at the north boundary, smoke coming from the chimney where Grace was making breakfast for their 2 children. Everything was present and accounted for and good. "I want to say something," Catherine said. "Say it," he said. "I was a woman hiding under someone else's name when you found me," she said. "I was frightened, though I was managing it. I was free but not yet safe. And you sat down at my table in a pie shop and asked me to tell you about my complicated situation as though that were a perfectly ordinary thing to say." She paused. "You have never, in 16 years and 2 children and a ranch and every hard thing in between, made me feel like anything less than the most complete version of myself. And I know that sounds like something people say, but I mean it in the specific technical sense that you have never once asked me to be smaller or quieter or more manageable." She looked at him. "That is an extraordinary thing, and I need you to know that I know it." He looked at her in the morning light. "You were never small," he said. "You came across a street in Kansas with a receipt and a backbone made of iron, and I barely got a word in the whole first conversation. I knew from the first 5 minutes that the best possible outcome for my life was to be in the vicinity of you for as long as you'd allow it." She smiled, the full smile, the real one, still the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and he had been seeing it for 16 years. "You proposed to me twice before you knew my name," she said. "I did," he said, "and I would do it exactly the same if it were to happen again." "That did not change a single thing," she said, quoting him back to himself across the 16 years. "Not one thing," he said. "Not then and not ever." She reached across the space between their horses and took his hand, and he held it, and they stayed on the rise while the April morning moved around them, the limestone hills holding the light the way limestone holds warmth slowly, with deep permanence. That evening, when the children were in bed, and the house was quiet with the specific quiet of a place full of sleeping life, Reuben and Catherine sat on the porch in the last of the spring evening. The stars were coming out over Kansas, extravagant as always, offering themselves without reserve. James would be a rancher. They both knew this without having discussed it. It was in the way he worked, the way he listened to the land, the way he talked about the cattle with a familiarity that had come from being raised among them. Eleanor would be something extraordinary. They both knew this too. She had her mother's precision and her father's refusal to be discouraged, and the combination was already formidable at 8 years old. Whatever she became, it would be entirely on her own terms, and it would be worth watching. And Reuben and Catherine Doyle would be here, on this porch, on this land, in the limestone hills south of Burlingame that they had stood on in the summer of 1885 and recognized as the place. The cattle trail was long finished. The letters were bundled in twine in the study. The silver ring had not left her finger in 13 years. The iron ring with its 2-word inscription had not left his. The park bench in Caldwell was still there, probably, under the cottonwood tree, and somewhere in it was embedded the specific weight of 2 people sitting together for the first time while the railroad depot hissed steam and children ran noisily around the edges of things, and a man said something completely unreasonable, and a woman said it back to him. "Happy," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Completely," she said. The stars continued their patient extravagance over the Kansas plain, and the creek ran along the eastern boundary of their land, and the cattle were quiet in the south field, and the children slept soundly in the house behind them, and Reuben Doyle held his wife's hand on their porch in the spring dark, and was, in the fullest and most permanent sense of the word, exactly where he had been moving toward since the afternoon he had crossed a dusty street in Caldwell. Kansas toward a woman who did not yet know that he was coming. He had not known her name. He had known her. And he had been right from the first moment. Through every mile of the trail between then and now, he had been absolutely right. It had not changed a single thing.